The Bab was a revolutionary prophet. His life was marked by drama and intrigue and tens of thousands of people following him.
750 soldiers shot. And when the smoke cleared, the Bab had vanished.
Less than 200 years ago, people all over the world experienced an intense and immediate expectation of a promised one. Major world religions, such as Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were each independently identifying the same time period, the mid-19th century, for the appearance of their promised one. On October 22nd, 1844, 100,000 followers gathered together in churches, homes, and fields in anticipation of the promised arrival of Jesus Christ. While Christians in the West were awaiting the return of Christ in 1844, at the same time in the East, Shia Muslims also awaited a divine messenger under a different name, the 12th Imam. They imagined that this 1,000-year-old person would return to the world as an agent of God to bring peace. The Orthodox religious and political leaders of Persia, while they paid lip service to the longed-for advent of the 12th Imam, they well knew that his arrival would signal the end of their power. One of the Shia Muslims who had been waiting for the 12th Imam in the years before 1844 was a religious scholar named Sheikh Ahmad. He led an independent movement of followers known as the Sheikhis in Persia and Iraq. Mullah Hussein and a few others determined to carry out their late teacher's dying wish to find the Promised One. He retired to a mosque for 40 days of prayer. Sayyid Kazem had told Mullah Hussein that he would know the Promised One when he delivered, without being asked to do so, a commentary on a chapter of the Quran known as the Surah of Joseph. And there, in Shiraz, something happened that would reverberate across the world. Mullah Hussein arrived on May 22nd, 1844, and soon noticed a striking young man who wore a green turban, signifying sacred lineage as a descendant of Muhammad. Mullah Hussein was surprised, but accepted the young man's invitation. As they approached the entrance to his home, the youth recited these words: "Enter therein in peace, secure." After the two men shared refreshments, it was time for evening prayers.
I have striven with all my soul.
With the youth by his side, Mullah Hussein prayed to God that he had so far failed in his quest to find the Promised One. But he reaffirmed his conviction that God's promise faileth not. He was so focused on his mission that initially he failed to comprehend that the object of his quest was sitting right next to him. The youth listened to Mullah Hussein's description of the Promised One, and then he said, "Behold, all these signs are manifest in me." Thrilled by the beauty and rapidity of his revelation, Mullah Hussein listened as the youth declared that he was the Bab, meaning the gate, sent by God to usher in a new age for mankind and herald another prophet even greater than he. Throughout the ages, God has sent many divine messengers: Krishna, Abraham, Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus Christ, and Muhammad. The arrival of the Bab and his ideas of progressive revelation mark a dramatic departure from traditional Islamic teaching. Persia, known today as Iran, is home to one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth and is considered one of the first great empires. When Islam swept through the region, Persia emerged as a center of the Islamic Golden Age, contributing significant culture, scholarship, and science to the world. It was in this environment that Syed Ali Muhammad, who would become known as the Bab, was born on October 20th, 1819, in Shiraz, Persia. He was a descendant of Abraham, and he was also a descendant of Muhammad, which gave him revered status in society. After his father died at a young age, he was raised by his mother and his uncle. When he was 20, he traveled to Karbala, Iraq, a city held sacred by Shia Muslims. During the summer of 1844, 17 more people became the first followers of the Bab. In many ways, these followers were like the 12 apostles of Christ. Prominent among them was the youngest disciple, Qudus. The Bab dispatched his disciples throughout Persia and Iraq to proclaim the coming of the new revelation. The people were expecting the return of the 12th Imam, but the message delivered by him was radically different. One of the most significant and dangerous teachings of the Bab was that each person could have their own relationship with God without the direction, mediation, or intercession of a cleric. And in town after town, his disciples found receptive listeners. Historians report that thousands of people accepted the Bab's claims and teachings. One of the Letters of the Living was a remarkable woman named Tahirih. Against the draconian customs of the time, her father allowed her to be educated. Tahirih was the only female Letter of the Living, and the only one not to have met the Bab personally. Grasping the ring on the venerable shrine, he cried out to the encircling crowd, "I am that promised one whose advent you have been awaiting." After the pilgrimage, the Bab and Qudus left the Arabian Peninsula to make the long journey back. Along the way, the Bab told Qudus that they would never meet again. He said, "Yours will be the ineffable joy of quaffing the cup of martyrdom for his sake. I too shall tread the path of sacrifice and will join you in the realm of eternity." Despite being officially ignored at Mecca, the Bab's proclamation shook the very core of traditional beliefs, and this could not be ignored in Persia. At the governor's palace, Hussein Khan accused the Bab of being a disgrace to Islam. The Bab simply replied by quoting a verse from the Quran, warning against ignorance. The Bab was placed under house arrest for most of the next year. But even unavailable to his followers, his message and fame continued to grow. And people from all over the kingdom began flocking to Shiraz to learn more about his teachings, hoping, praying for an opportunity to meet the Bab himself. The king of Persia, known as the Shah, was finally forced to pay attention. Proceeding cautiously, he sent Vahid, his most trusted scholar, to investigate the cause of the Bab. Vahid made a solemn vow. If he found the Bab to be false, he would strike him down with the Shah's sword. If he found the Bab to be true, he would lay down his own life for him. Vahid later wrote, "If all the powers of the earth were allied against me, they would be powerless to shake my confidence in the greatness of his cause." When the Shah received the message of his most trusted scholar, he reportedly told his prime minister, "If Vahid is a Babi, we should stop belittling the cause of the Bab." And so the Shah's specific wishes were ignored, and Hussein Khan ordered that any person in Shiraz found in possession of the Bab's writings would face severe punishment. After arresting the three men, they were heading towards the prison, but were confronted with panic in the streets. Shiraz had been overwhelmed by a fierce cholera epidemic, and the population was terrified. The constable took his prisoners to his own home, where they discovered that the constable's son had contracted cholera and was on the verge of death. The anguished father begged the Bab to save his son. He instructed the constable to give his child water the Bab had used for his ritual washing before prayers. and to the constable's great relief, his boy recovered. Afterwards, the constable asked the governor to release the Bab, and he did so, on the condition that the Bab leave Shiraz forever. He was not given a moment to say goodbye to his mother or his wife. In exile, the Bab decided to go north to Isfahan. When he arrived there in September 1846, the Bab contacted the governor of Isfahan, Manashir Khan, in the hope that he could convince the governor of his authenticity. Instantly, they understood their inability to challenge the Bab, and so refused to engage with him that day. Manashir Khan became increasingly protective of the Bab and offered to donate his substantial wealth to further his cause. But the Bab refused this offer, saying his cause would triumph through the sacrifices of the poor and lowly. The Bab's enemies had him arrested and sent to Tehran, the capital city, to face the highest authority in Persia, the Shah. But in Tehran, at the king's palace, the prime minister was deeply worried that the Shah would also fall under the sway of the Bab, thus diminishing his own power. But the long journey took the Bab through the city of Tabriz, and it was there, reminiscent of the triumphant entrance of Jesus into Jerusalem, that the streets were filled with the curious and the devoted alike, all cheering and struggling to catch a glimpse of the Bab. Even the soldiers who escorted him were reported to be visibly overcome with love. The Bab faced a solitary imprisonment at Maku, a fort surrounded by a huge rock that blocked out the sun. There, shadowy days stretched into long, dark nights. He was denied even a basic lamp for light. Yet he used this time to reveal hundreds of thousands of verses. In these writings from prison, the Bab offered a radical reinterpretation of the day of resurrection. Although the prime minister was successful at distancing the Bab from his devoted followers, nothing could keep them from him. The hardened warden of Maku, gradually won over by the Bab, was becoming more lenient with his privileges. But back in Tehran, the prime minister was infuriated by his inability to suppress the Bab's growing movement or control his own warden. So he sent him to a prison in an even more severe location called Chirikh. His plan was unsuccessful, as once again, the new warden was so moved by the Bab that he too discontinued the harsh condition the prime minister had commanded and allowed his followers, hungry for new teachings, to come to him. The conference was attended by nearly all of the Bab's key disciples, including Tahirih and Mirza Hussein Ali, who would later play a much greater role in the movement when he became known as Baha'u'llah, the glory of God. The public proclamation of a new religion was grounds for a charge of heresy. So, in July of 1848, the Bab was summoned to Tabriz to stand trial before a group of hostile clerics and the crown prince of Persia. They questioned the Bab about his teachings and admonished him to recant his claims. But they didn't believe him and demanded he perform a miracle. The Bab replied that he had already performed the same miracle as the Prophet Muhammad, the revelation of the Word of God. In their ruling, the clerics ordered that the Bab be subjected to a torture known as the bastinado, where the soles of the victim's feet would be violently beaten. Just weeks after the trial at Tabriz, the Shah of Persia died. Upheaval erupted across the kingdom. The Bab's followers were the most convenient scapegoats and were targeted by the prime minister as enemies of the state. In northern Persia, a group of Babis, led by Mullah Hussein, were severely harassed and some were murdered. Seeking to escape this persecution while observing the Bab's teaching of nonviolence, the beleaguered Babis petitioned the governor to provide safe passage out of town. The duplicitous governor agreed and sent a detachment of soldiers. But the Babis had been deceived. The soldiers turned on them and started shooting. Mullah Hussein led the Babis on a successful counterattack. The soldiers were beaten back, and the few surviving soldiers fled. Realizing that they would soon face a larger army, the Babis took shelter in a fort known as Sheikh Tabarsi. But Mullah Hussein was later killed when a bullet struck him in the chest. Yet the Babis continued to hold out for months, frustrating the king's army. The Babis realized it was a trick, but surrendered anyway out of reverence for the Quran. Still imprisoned in Sharik, the Bab was overcome with grief as he learned the fate of his faithful followers. When he emerged from his grief, he resumed his writings, urging his followers to prepare for him whom God shall make manifest. In the summer of 1850, the Prime Minister of Persia ordered that the Bab be brought to Tabriz for public execution by firing squad. The captain of the regiment assigned to carry out the execution was an Armenian Christian named Sam Khan. He had heard of the Bab and was deeply conflicted about carrying out his orders for fear of angering God himself over killing an innocent man. With this advice, Sam Khan decided he would move forward.
And the guards came for the Bab, and he said, "I'm not finished dictating my final instructions to my secretary."
A very uncouth soldier said, "The time has come. You must come now. It is time for your execution."
The Bab said, "No power on earth can prevent me from finishing this final task."
The guard ignored the Bab's warning and led him to the public square. There, he and his young follower Anis were suspended with ropes against a pillar.
Thousands of people had gathered to witness the execution of the Bab. There were people on rooftops. There were dignitaries, there were journalists, and people from every walk of life.
Because it was a big thing. They were killing a descendant of the Prophet.
A firing squad of 750 soldiers from the king's army moved into position.
To show the majesty of a state and also the fear of the government. They thought that the Babis might engage in an armed insurrection.
The order was given. Fire! The soldiers fired. The smoke from their hundreds of guns filled the square.
And when that smoke cleared, Anis stood unharmed, smiling, and the Bab had vanished. The people were absolutely astonished. They could not believe their eyes. They were filled with fear and awe. What had happened? How could 750 rifles have missed? And yet, the Bab was gone from sight.
So there was this quick search to find where did the Bab go to? And they found him back in the room inside the prison, speaking to his amanuensis, his secretary.
The Bab turned to them and said, "Now that I have concluded, you may do with me as you wish."
Meanwhile, Sam Khan told his regiment of Christian Armenian soldiers, "That's it. We've done our job once. We're not going to do it again." And he left.
A second regiment was assembled to execute the Bab. As the Bab was suspended for a second time against the pillar with Anis, he spoke his final words to the multitude. "Had you believed in me, O wayward generation, every one of you would have followed the example of this youth. The day will come when you will have recognized me. That day I shall have ceased to be with you."
At that point, the command was given again for the soldiers to shoot, and the Bab and his companion were executed.
The Bab's body was shattered by the bullets, except for his face, which mysteriously remained untouched. At that moment, reminiscent of the crucifixion of Jesus, a powerful storm descended upon Tabriz. Dust darkened the sky until it appeared to be night at midday. There are many accounts of what happened that day, including from government sources. They differ in some details, but the one fact on which they all agree is that the first volley fired by the Christian regiment missed the Bab completely.
The Bab consistently reject their miracles as the proof of the truth of the prophet of God. But the Bab goes further than this. He forbids his followers to attribute any miracle to him. And therefore, the final event in the life of the Bab is not defined as a miraculous event, yet there is really no plausible explanations for that. And therefore, it remains a mysterious event in the sacred history of the world.
After the Bab's martyrdom, his enemies attempted one final humiliation. His remains were thrown next to the moat outside the city wall to be eaten by animals. But his followers were able to steal them away in the middle of the night. His remains were kept hidden for 59 years. But in 1852, 2 years after the martyrdom of the Bab, a group of Babis, still reeling from the murder of their prophet, attempted to assassinate the Shah of Persia. The plan was bungled. The Shah survived. The new prime minister ordered an all-out assault against the Babis, killing thousands.